Please join me in giving Sedgwick County Commissioner Chairman Richard Ranzau a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Well, I want to thank John and everybody for the opportunity to speak here today amongst friends. It's well, John asked me to speak and kind of talk about some of the things that we've done or the direction we think we're going, and so I thought about it. And there's a lot have been said about what we've done, what we're doing, what we're going to do, and the direction we're going, and what it is we're trying to do. And so I thought today we'll really, in my mind, what we're trying to do is restore core American values to Sedgwick County. Okay, I think we've kind of lost our way as a country, and we've lost track of what those core American values are and what it means to actually implement them. A few weeks ago, I think it was somebody in the Democratic Party was asked, what's the difference between the Socialist Party and the Democrat Party? Well, of course, the answer is nothing. Yeah. But then I'll ask you, what's the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? You can make an argument that it's only the speed at which we're moving towards socialism and tyranny. Okay? So I say that out of love for my fellow Republicans, because we need to hold ourselves accountable and ensure that we live up to the values that say that we believe in. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. I want to start off by talking about my approach to government so you know where I'm coming from and understand, kind of what I'm looking for. It might help understand my point of view. But first, I'll start off by saying where I got here. My journey here in political life started in 2004. Before that time, I wasn't really involved in politics. I paid attention. I voted most years. And if you asked me, I would say I was conservative, and I might be able to tell you what that meant in some regard. And if you asked me if I believed in capitalism and the Constitution, I would say yeah, but I probably couldn't even give you many reasons why or give you an in-depth idea of what that meant. When I got back from Iraq in 2004, I began to get frustrated with how some in Congress were dealing with the war in general. And that kind of stirred an interest in federal politics. And that grew from there. And I started learning, and I went through a process in which I questioned everything I believed. And I asked myself, what is it that I do believe? And if so, what does that mean? I asked myself, do I really believe in capitalism, or is socialism better? And if so, what does that mean? What does capitalism mean? What is socialism? And what are the pros and cons? So I read lots of stuff. I listened to lots of stuff. I listened to Fox News. I listened to MSNBC, CNN, everything to hear what everybody was saying. I got into things like economics, Keynesian economics versus Hayek, stuff I've never even heard of before. And I remember thinking several times when I'd sit down and start to read stuff on economics, and I said, do I really have to read this stuff? And I said yes, because to understand the arguments and to figure out where I'm going to stand, I have to read, I have to understand both sides. So I investigated all those sorts of things: global warming, the Constitution. What does life, liberty, and property really mean? What does limited government really mean? And so that you get into reading what the founders said, the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers and all this, and understand the history in greater detail than what I've ever had before. But some people say, well, I'm just tied to my ideology. Well, we all have our ideology. But when I began this journey, it was from a pragmatic point of view. I questioned myself. I questioned capitalism versus socialism because I want to know what really works best. I didn't want to just say I was a capitalist. I wanted to understand why I believe in a free market capitalist society and what the benefits are over socialism. Okay? So I took a pragmatic approach. So the values that I have today, I believe, are very pragmatic. The values that I believe and I espouse now, I do so because I believe they work. And I believe history has shown that. And I think we're going through a process in which we're strained from our values, and we're paying the price for it. So just kind of in general, Because people ask me, well, are you a conservative, are you a Republican, are you a libertarian, or whatever? And I would say these are the, three things that, I think I'm a constitutional conservative, which means I believe in the Constitution, the principles behind it. I'm a fiscal conservative, which you probably already know that. I believe in free market capitalism. I believe in free market capitalism, true free market capitalism. A lot of the things that we hear about and people complain about really aren't free market capitalism, okay? When we get criticized for some people supporting a bailout of the banks and say, well, see, those capitalists, they do, all they care about is the rich people. Well, that's not capitalism. Okay, that's cronyism. That violates free market capitalism. There was no constitutional authority, as far as I'm concerned, to do any of that. And so I think free market capitalism gets a bad name because certain things that are done in the name of capitalism really aren't capitalistic in nature. So these are kind of the general overall values or descriptions I think would apply to where I come from. I think these all three of these kind of reinforce each other as well. I mean, if you're a constitutional conservative, you're going to be fiscally responsible because the government's going to spend less money and there's going to be more free market capitalism. Okay, so they all kind of reinforce each other. But one of the things that we always have this debate amongst government or within communities within our nation, how much government there should be and what the role of government is. That's really one of the first questions or fundamental questions that we have to answer for ourselves, that what is the role of government? And there's lots of different opinions out there, but they basically come down, in my mind, towards individual freedom and collectivism. So I want to talk a little bit about, before we get to that, I want to say, where is the county headed? Well, here's, the Eagle did a editorial criticizing some of the budget stuff we were doing about a month ago. Surprise, surprise. But they quoted me as saying something in one of our meetings. And I basically said I would argue that the county is going to move to the center. Because they always talk, we're going extreme right, extreme right. Well, my philosophy is based upon James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and people like that. If you consider them extreme right, then so be it. But nevertheless, I would argue we're actually moving back towards the center. Back to core American values. I would argue that the county, state, and country have moved so far to the left we don't recognize core American values. Okay? I'm talking about things like fiscal responsibility, individual freedom, property rights, individual responsibility, limited government. These are all things we talk about, and it's easy to say them, but when we put them into practice, what does that mean? And I think we're starting to do that in the county, and some people don't like it, and some people do, and we'll continue to have that debate. As far as, and this whole debate, like I said, goes back to what is the role of government? Well, this is what one of our resident socialists says the government's role is. This is out of an article done in the Eagle. He says, Davis Merritt says, for example, government does exist to produce public goods. To produce public goods, and a list of a variety of things, some of the things which we might agree with, some of the things that we might not. But I've heard this said a lot, that it's the government's job to produce or provide public goods. Is it really the job of the government to produce things for us? I mean, John Kennedy, a Democrat, said, don't ask what your country will do for you, but what you can do for your country. But it even goes further than that. Is that really the function of government, to produce public goods? Now the government does do some things that help us all. For example, safety, police and fire. But what's our core belief that causes us to do that? Is it based upon just that it's their job to provide things for us? Or is it, I would say it's a little different. I'll go back to this document, the Declaration of Independence. I mean, that forms the basis for the founding of our country. And it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So our Declaration of Independence tells us right here why we created our constitutional republic: to secure your rights, to protect your individual rights. Okay? So for example, if we talk about police or the court of law, the rule of law basically, it's all established to help protect your individual rights, your individual property rights specifically. Okay? So we can get to the same place on some of the things that the collectivists believe, but the origin is different. But if we keep this in mind, as we face some of the decisions that we make in political life, this will help guide us. In some directions, we'll end up the same spot as the collectivists end up, in other places we won't. And we'll talk about some of them later, I think. But this is very important. We're talking about the government exists to protect our individual rights. Okay, that's the unique difference between the United States and all the countries that existed before. There was always some form of collectivism involved with everything else, whether it was a socialist oligarchy or a communist oligarchy, or maybe a king or a dictator who said he was in charge, ordained by God, and he's going to do what's good for everybody else, for the common good. I would argue that the common good is actually a myth, but nevertheless, that was the justification. They're going to do what's best for everybody, have this collective side, and the individual didn't matter. What we saw through the experiment called America, that when you unleash the power of the individual, you have prosperity. And that produces more than any amount of centralized government planning that's done on behalf of the common good than you could ever imagine. So I think fundamentally, we tend to have a difference of opinion on what the proper role of the government is, and I think it's important to understand that. And before we get into county stuff, here's something, when I was going through all my readings, I know we often talk about the federal government and what the role of the federal government is, etc. And it's very interesting always to read what the founding fathers said about the Constitution back in the time when they were trying to get it passed. Because they were very, very much concerned about a government that was too powerful, okay? And so here you have a quote, some information from James Madison in Federalist 45. As many of you probably know, when the Constitution was suggested for ratification, there was a big debate. A lot of people didn't want to ratify it because they were afraid the federal government would get too much power. And of course, James Madison, he and some others wrote the Federalist Papers. This is one of them. And James Madison is making the argument, listen, we need to ratify the Constitution because it does not give the federal government too much power. In fact, what he says is, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. That means they're defined. You can read them. There's nothing in the penumbra of the Constitution or anything else. It's right there. Okay? Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former, meaning the federal government, will be exercised principally on external objects, such as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last, the power of taxation will for the most part be connected, means the federal government can have the power to tax to do those things. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. So, if anyone is going to regulate how much water we flush down our toilet, who do you think James Madison would think would have that authority? The states. All right? Who would have the authority to regulate our streams and our ditches in our states? Or anything else for that matter, all right? Now, we have over time abandoned this principle. We've abandoned the Constitution for the variety of decisions that have made at the Supreme Court that have gradually increased the federal government's authority to the point now that we have congressmen and presidents, both Democrat and Republican, who don't even ask before they write a bill whether or not it's permissible under the Constitution. They used to actually have that debate. That would be one of the first questions they have. Is this permitted under the Constitution? Now they just say, well, we're going to pass it and let the Supreme Court decide for us. So that's why the Supreme Court has become so politicized. You just need 5 people to say yes or no, and then you win that fight. And of course, they have, by and large, abandoned their responsibility to the Constitution. We're arguing about things like, well, subsidies for Obamacare, whether or not it was intended for the states or the federal government. If you enroll on the state or the federal level, whether or not you're supposed to get subsidies or not. And we're arguing about that. Well, if we take a look at the Constitution, we'll understand, I don't care where the subsidies come for health care, that's not authorized in the Constitution at all. So we shouldn't even be asking that question. The discussion about funding Planned Parenthood is largely between pro-life and pro-choice factions. But that's not the question we should be asking. Is there anything in the Constitution that authorizes the federal government to be in charge of family planning? I don't care whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. If you're pro-Constitution, the answer is no. And let's move on. So this goes, I don't want to talk too much about the federal government, but that is the biggest thing that's the biggest issue we face. We had a lot of Republicans in the last election at the federal level run on they were going to defund Obamacare. We now control the House and Senate, and did that happen? So I have had some tell me, and they can make a good argument to say that the fight at the federal level is lost, that the only way to solve it is at the state level, and that's a discussion for another day. But the problem is both Democrats and Republicans, I don't hear any Republicans standing up that funding for Planned Parenthood or subsidies for health care or housing are constitutionally illegal. Why not? Because in order to be consistent, then you'd also have to say things like subsidies for farms are also constitutionally illegal. And we don't want to go down that road, do we? So, let's move on. So, the title of this topic is Returning Core American Values to Sedgwick County. Well, in order to do that, you have to figure out what you think core American values are. Okay? Now, there's any number of them that you could come up with, but here are some of the things that I believe are core American values. That's limited government, particularly as we discussed earlier about the difference between federal and state. The federal government is supposed to be very limited. And even at the state's supposed to have a lot more latitude than the federal government, but they still have an obligation to protect individual life, liberty, and property. Now back up to limited government. I've already talked about some examples of what our founding fathers would think about the limited government. That's one of the biggest ones for me that really shocked me as I was doing a lot of reading about what limited government really means at the federal level, what things they should and should not be involved in. Because if you go back and read what they read, it's like, wow, I didn't realize they felt the state should have that much authority, but they did. The states were independent nations, sovereign states. Okay? Do they act that way now? Or are they serfs to the federal government? So when we examine what limited government really means, that has the vast majority of the things the federal government done would not be supported by our founders. Okay? And that has repercussions, but I think it would be good. We wouldn't be in the fiscal mess that we're in. We wouldn't have millions and millions of people dependent on the government for their livelihood. You'd have a lot stronger work ethic. You'd have a lot stronger country in general if we held strong to our beliefs. I mean, the myth of collectivism, whether it be socialism, progressivism, communism, is that the government can solve all those problems and everything will be hunky-dory. And that's simply not true. It creates more misery than it'll ever solve. But individual freedom, life, liberty, and property. Property rights are the cornerstone of our legal system of our country. If you have individual property rights, that's the key, and that's why we need to protect them as strongly as we can. Life, liberty, property. You know, I sat in a meeting once in which I heard a professor from KU is talking about obesity and all the high blood pressure and all this other sort of stuff, and she tried to say it was all society's problem and we shouldn't be bashing on the individual. She says we need to think less about the individual, more about the collective. This is from a KU professor. She has a degree in community psychology. Think about that. Do communities have psychologists? No. I mean, how can you get a degree in community psychology? I mean, the taxpayers are funding that stuff. It's absurd. But it goes back to the idea, and I said then, I spoke up then, I said, John, the guy next to me, said, listen, I'm overweight. It's not John's fault. Okay, don't blame it on him or society. I know what it takes. All right? There's no collective solution to my health problems. Either I do it or nobody will. All right? And we need to stop acting like there are. And we need to have the courage to stand up and say it's about the individual. Okay? Don't try and give me collective solutions to my problems because, for example, because first of all, sometimes things that you perceive as a problem really isn't, okay, from my perspective, but I can solve those problems if you just give me the freedom to do so. Individual responsibility, I kind of alluded to that recently, or in my last, I said, if I want to take individual responsibility for my life, that's what I need to do. But that has repercussions. If we say people are responsible for their own well-being, that means the collective isn't. And progressives don't like that because they want to force you to spend money on solutions for problems in other people's lives, even if those solutions don't work. Okay? Fiscal responsibility. I think if you do all the things listed above, you'll be fiscally responsible. But even in the things that we find we should do as a government, for example, let's say build roads and bridges, we still want to do it responsibly. And just because it is a function of government that we all agree on doesn't mean we should just willy-nilly throw a bunch of money on it and waste money, right? And there's always opportunities out there to find ways to save taxpayer money if you're willing to ask, if you're willing to investigate, if you're willing to read and challenge what you're being told. So, can we all agree that these are some core American values? Yeah. All right. So, let's apply them to a few situations. Let's say, for example, the federal government offers us $1.5 million for local planning. But they set the goals and criteria for that plan. Okay, think about it. The federal government says, we're going to give you some money to do some local planning. Here's the goals and criteria. You have some leeway within that, but you need to meet our requirements for your local planning. And then all plans, local plans in your area, need to be subject to that plan. Well, what do we think about that when we look at our core values? What about limited government? I said Federalist 45. Is there anything in the Constitution that gives the federal government the authority to do anything with local planning? Zero. And if you knew more about the federal grant and exactly what they wanted to do, you would know that it contradicted life, liberty, and property, and individual freedoms, things like that. And when the government spends money federal government spends money when they're already $1 trillion in debt on programs they shouldn't even be doing, that's not fiscally responsible. And ultimately, this is really about control, right? Okay? For me, that's easy. The day we discussed that grant, I think 30 of you showed up and said, no, don't do that. And 2 people showed up and said, yes. They were actually going to be employed by this grant. But the grant passed anyway. James knows a little bit about that. Some of you other guys do too. Well, how about this? Earlier this year, the federal government offered us a grant that requires us to, this is the very first requirement, to implement food and beverage guidelines, including sodium standards for food service guidelines for cafeterias and vending in public situations, work sites, and other key locations such as hospitals. Now let's put this up against our core American values and just, okay, is that consistent with limited government? Is that something the federal government should do? No, I don't think so. I would argue no level of government should do that, but in particular, we know from Federalist 45 that if a government is going to do it, it should be who? The states, not the feds. What about individual freedom and individual responsibility? Well, it violates those principles, does it not? It's not fiscally responsible either. Once again, the federal government's going to spend money on a program that they shouldn't even be doing. There's a lot of stuff going in under the guise of public health. Public health, okay? This is the one sort of thing. This was in the media put out there as, it was a fight against diabetes and high blood pressure, and we oppose this because we want everybody to die from heart disease, right? Well, think about it. We spend billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars in healthcare, in government programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and then in the private sector with insurance and prescriptions, billions and billions, trillions of dollars on healthcare. Yet we still have a problem with diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, okay? You think a federal grant of a couple $100,000 for 3, 4, 5 years is going to magically solve all that? So not only does it violate virtually all of our core American principles, it's just nonsensical. Because ultimately what it's really about is about control. This is the sort of thing that you get, or at least the things like Bloomberg saying, you can only have a soda so big, right? That's going to solve obesity. Come on, really? So for me, this isn't about whether or not I care about people who are obese. This is about whether or not I care about core American values, about lying to people. Taking this grant program to say it's going to help diabetes and strokes and solve all these great problems is a lie. Much of what you hear from the public health community, I think, is a lie. We spend millions of dollars, despite some of the cuts that we had in the health department this year, which were very modest. We still spend 11.2 million, by the way, in the health department. We continue to spend millions of dollars on programs that don't work because they're politically sensitive. And we've always done it. So, next, what else do we have? Well, how about this? Roads and bridges. Now, we spend money on roads and bridges. I think most of us agree that's a core function of government, okay? But let's say we repeatedly borrow money every single year. We do. We repeatedly borrow $4 million a year. But as a result of that repeated borrowing, we spend $5.7 million in cash for principal and interest payments. But because of the money we take out to pay those principal and interest payments, we actually get $2.4 million worth of net road and bridge projects every year. This is what we're fighting about. These are the details that you probably never heard. You tell me, does that make sense to you? Is that fiscally responsible? I voted against this every single time since I got into office. And I asked people, I asked our CFO, I asked everybody, all right, this doesn't make sense. If I'm missing something here, please tell me what I'm missing and why this makes sense. Please. Because I like to do my research and make decisions based upon facts. And I've asked, and it's just the way we always do it. We've done it for a long time, and we can afford it. Oh, we have a AAA bond rating. Yeah, we'll be. It still doesn't make sense. And one of the things I like to ask myself, would I do this with my own money or something similar in my personal life? No. Most of you wouldn't either. So then why would I do it with your money? These are fights I'm willing to stand up and fight for because I know in the long run they make sense and they make us a stronger community. Okay? Well, that's a good question. I'd like to reduce, and I think we are going to reduce our dependence on borrowed money. We're going to pay more things with cash because we can. If we operate things correctly, we can pay things with cash, save money, still be responsible. Maybe sometimes, you'll borrow money for your house. I did. But I don't borrow money for my food and clothing on it, and then pay interest. Okay? Or if I do, I end up bankrupt. Okay? So there are some times when it's appropriate to borrow money, but there's some times when it's appropriate not to. I've been fortunate enough that my wife and I and my family, we've been able to get debt-free. We don't owe any debt. It is very liberating. It empowers you. You have so much more flexibility. I worry so much less about, every financial thing there is. Okay, no matter how bad the economy gets, I'm going to be better off than vast majority of people in the United States, right? Can you just think about that if the county was in that position? You're never going to get there if you don't at least try or don't have that dream. Even if we never get to the point where I'd like to be, I think we're going to get to the point where we're much better off. It takes time to turn the ship around and to get ahead in the right direction, but we're headed in the right direction. You'll start seeing some of that fruits in the next year, and then a year after that, and the year after that. If we can stay the course, we'll provide those core services. We'll even provide funding for some programs that don't work, and we probably shouldn't do just because it's not politically expedient to defund them. But we'll provide all the core services, and we'll spend more cash. We'll save money in the long run, and we'll make our community even stronger. So this particular issue didn't violate limited government or individual responsibility, individual freedom. It was purely fiscally responsible decision. It's this type of decision that could go on year after year after year without the general public never knowing it existed unless you ask questions and challenge what you're being told. Okay? What about this? Should we fund the Arts Council? No. Well, some people say no. Some people say yes. So what do? Well, I say let's go back to our core values. What about limited government? I think it violates that principle. What about individual freedom and individual responsibility? Well, let's put it this way. There's a group of people who want to fund the Arts Council, and there's a group of people who don't. Should they have the freedom to decide for themselves? Right now, if the county funds it, and we were only giving them $14,000 a year, then the group of people who want to fund the Arts Council is happy. But the people who don't want to fund the Arts Council, or maybe they don't want to fund them as much, or maybe they want to give their money to somebody else, or maybe they do want to fund the Arts Council, but they just want to be able to write their own check. They're not happy, and they're completely disenfranchised. They don't get a say in the matter, right? Right? Well, think about it. So that violates individual freedom to decide and the individual responsibility to support those organizations that we feel are important. But if the county stops funding it and we give it back to the private sector, then we empower the private sector. We empower every single individual in our community to be involved in that decision. Right? Every single one of you is now a part of that decision starting next year. You can decide to give or not to give. And you can decide how much. Okay? What is wrong with that? What's wrong with empowering every single taxpayer in this community to decide how much funding the Arts Council will get? Okay? I think there's anything wrong with it. Several months ago, I met with the head of the Arts Council, and he told me, to be honest, if you do this, you'll probably piss off enough people that I'll raise a lot more than $14,000 a year. That's what he told me. So then why do they show up complaining about it? Because it's the easy way out, right? If if you can get funding from the government, where the government can forcibly take your money, then you're assured of it every year after year after year. And that's what we do with a lot of grants. We keep doing it because we've been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years, and so we feel like we have to keep doing it. But if you have to go out and sell your ideas to the community in the marketplace of ideas, then it's a lot harder. I actually had one person a couple years ago who gets money from the county say, I really don't want to have to go out and fight for my own money. And I thought to myself, I bet you don't. But you should, because that truly, see, that's the beauty of capitalism and of empowering the free market is you truly get to see what the priorities of the community are when people are empowered to make the decisions for themselves. And the American people are incredibly generous. And if there are poor and needy or good programs out there that need support, they will do it, but you need to make the case. They will do it. I have faith in our community to invest in those things that they feel are important that will make our community stronger. I believe they will. Somebody will step up and do it. Right now, it's only determined by 3 people. If 3 people on the county commission are influenced by enough people, a very small number of people, relatively small number of people, to say that's important, then that really reflects their own judgment. It really doesn't reflect the will of the community. I think by doing this way, by empowering the community to decide on what programs will be funded in the private sector, is a much better way. It truly does empower our community, and it gives us a better reflection of what our community wants. And it also allows, if a program is good and people start funding it, that's good. If it gets out of hand and starts spending too much money on overhead or it becomes less effective, then, and people find out about it, boom, you can make a change right away, right? I'll give a story. I don't know if many of you have read, how much time do I have? I'm talking longer than what I thought. Read a book by John Bolton. I know you guys know about him. He used to be the ambassador to the UN. He talked about all the different programs at the UN, the vast majority of which have a reputation of just being completely ineffective. And those programs, all the countries are forced to participate in. But there's a couple programs, and I can't remember the name of them, I'm sorry. I just thought of this off the top of my head, that work very, very well and have a reputation of actually being good programs. And those programs rely on voluntary donations from the member countries. Okay? They know if they don't perform, they won't get the money. Those other programs, they know they get the money no matter what, because they only have to go to a small group of people and say, force them to give us all their money. So that's just another example of that. What about the bait shop at Lake Afton? Well, this is very interesting, because 4 years into my first term, the manager came in and said, "Hey, let's shut down." This was for financial reasons. Let's shut down the Lake Afton bait shop because we're going to save some money. And of course, you're a limited government guy, and we shouldn't be in the bait business, right? And I said, well, okay, let's just do that. All right. So we did that. But 6 months to a year later, I can't remember how long it was, I went out there and I talked to the guy at the bait shop. And I asked him some questions. Okay? I said, what would you do to help make this more efficient and cost the taxpayers less of a subsidy, because we're having to give some money to support Lake Afton? He said, well, I would reopen the bait shop and allow them to sell baits and pop and stuff that turn over a lot, make a lot of profit. We'd make more money. Because here's the deal. We didn't really shut down the bait shop. We still had a lady in the bait shop selling passes to be in the park for vehicles and camping. So we had someone there. We shortened our hours a little bit, but she was sitting there in virtually an empty building. Okay? She could have been selling pop and minnows and bait that make a huge profit. Okay? And draw people in. Because what has happened is when you don't sell that stuff, fewer people go out there, so we lose more money, we have to subsidize it even more. Okay? Because the argument really wasn't about limited government. Because because we were in the lake business is what it was. We could have a discussion about being in the lake business or not, but if we're going to be in the lake business, if we can run a bait shop and have the people that use it pay more into it by the stuff that they buy, and therefore reduce the amount of money we have to spend in property taxes, Isn't that the fiscally responsible thing to do? So I changed my mind on that, not because I think the government needs to be in the business of selling bait, because I want to be fiscally responsible. Because along that same line, when we shut down the bait shop, we had $15,000 worth of inventory left. And the manager said, put that stuff in a building and don't sell it, because we don't want to confuse people. I said, listen, we should at least sell that $15,000 and get our money back, right? No. So they locked it up. Now you tell me, if you're going out of business, you're going to sell everything you can, right? It made no sense. So this is an example where if you don't ask questions, and April of my first term, I didn't know enough to ask questions. I didn't know the right questions to ask. And then I went out and I spoke to the individual who actually, the boots on the ground, asked what we could do to make it better, and I got the real answer. Although, interestingly enough, I had to pull it out of him because he was afraid he would get in trouble from the manager for telling me stuff. Okay? That problem's going to be solved here pretty soon. What about corporate welfare? First of all, using the term corporate welfare offends some people who get corporate welfare. They've let me know that. So, of course, I'm going to continue to use it. In fact, someone called me about the use of that term here recently. It was about the same time that Charles Koch did an article about corporate welfare in relation to the banks, and I wonder if he happened to pick up the phone and try to chastise Mr. Koch as well. But I was told that the term corporate welfare is toxic, and I agree. It is toxic. And stop doing it. And this is really, the Republican Party, for all its great things, has been plagued with the problem of corporate welfare virtually from its inception, for those of you who may not know. But clearly, it violates limited government principles, individual freedom. If I have the freedom to work hard for my family and provide for my family, I should have the freedom of how I spend my money and not have it taken from me and given to somebody else who has a business. If I want to voluntarily do that, then I will do it. Okay? So this is a big one that we often talk about, but I think it violates all of our conservative principles. But it's a problem that we struggle with in the Republican Party. A lot of people criticize capitalism when they see things that are really corporate welfare. And a lot of Republicans will try to justify this by saying this is being pro-business. Yeah, it's not really pro-business. This is the progressive value of government getting involved in something they shouldn't be involved in, of manipulating the economy. That's what the communists thought that they could do. They can manipulate the economy, right? And control, obviously it's to a great large degree, of what's going to be produced and who's going to produce it and how many they're going to produce and who the winners and losers are. Another troubling thing, I've had some people who benefit from corporate welfare complain about individual welfare and talk about how it creates a sense of entitlement. But that same individual chastised me for saying that some people have a sense of entitlement when they use corporate welfare. How is that any different? I've had a couple people tell me that. It goes down to, we all say, hey, cut these government programs, then that really means cut your program, your program, your program, and your program, but don't cut my program because I'm different, it's special, and it really does make a difference, okay? That's hogwash. Okay? We need to stick to our core value. Did we really make it great because of corporate welfare? Now, I'm not opposed to corporations making money and making as much money as they can. But they need to do it fair and square on a level playing field with their own money. All right?